Thank you so much for having me join you today. It's a real honor and a pleasure. This happens to coincidentally be the launch day for this book in various editions around the world. So I'm very grateful that we aligned our schedules accordingly, and that you've taken such an interest in this book. And it's I that have already learned a lot from you and your work, and those of you participating in your organizations that are so focused on this Great Lakes region. I first wrote an article sort of, promoting in some ways inadvertently the region about more than 10 years ago, when I was searching for the future of human geography and trying to understand what the climate oases of the future are. And that's the story that really begins at the beginning, that I write about in the beginning of this book, because it was the genesis of the process of writing it. But along the way, a whole bunch of things sort of intervened before I finally got around to doing this book about the future of human geography. And that's kind of where I want to start the story. I want to give a global overview of some of the trends I see, and then hone in to North America and the Great Lakes region, and talk about some of the technological, political, and other lessons that I've learned in the course of my research. So I'm going to just share my screen now and bring up the slides and jump right in. So I mentioned human geography right now, and let me be clear that that's one of 4 layers of geography. And the problem with our geographical understanding, and I'm going to be cruel here, but most people around the world are cartographically illiterate, let's just say. And that's a term, that's an epithet that was hurled at me, freshman year of college, alongside all of the other students who were automatically enrolled in a class called Map of the Modern World. I also tell that story in the book. And we learned, to think of geography not just as one static layer or thing, not just natural geography, which is to say our planet, geology, ecosystems, not just political geography, though, as you very well know, this map on your left is the one that we bias towards. It's the one that hangs in every office and classroom around the world. And I find it very paradoxical, if not perverse, that we teach our children from the day they're born to think of the world as divided by political lines, rather than having any kind of organic unity to it, other than the cosmic. That bothers me deeply, and it's been part of the motivation for my work all along. And we can't think of the world purely in terms of the functional geography of infrastructure at the bottom, though I do believe that it merits deep analysis, and it's really the kind of subject of the prequel to this book. And then there's human geography. And again, maybe the greatest irony of all, that we don't spend enough time visualizing our own geography, the geography of us, the distribution of the human species around the planet. You would think that that would matter enough that it merits being visualized and depicted all over the world on a regular basis, but it doesn't. And the truth is that it's not that I want to privilege one or the other. I've now written books about each of these layers of geography. They're all very important. But what's most important is to view them together. It's to have an integrated view of demographics, resources, borders, infrastructure, and other variables, quite frankly. And if you want to understand how the world works, to put it bluntly, you actually have to view all of these as, in many ways, equally important, or more important than that, simply influencing each other, shaping each other, affecting each other, and all of them really having an impact on where we live, where we can live, in the distribution of people around the world. So this is a map that actually I've never really shown before, because it was just finished in the last couple of days. And it was a painstaking effort to kind of, put in the layers of natural resource distribution, of human populations, of infrastructure investment, and political borders. And I hope you'll agree that it is complex. Some might think it's ugly, others might think it's beautiful. I'm in the latter camp. But it is certainly a more accurate way, I would say, or gets towards a more accurate way of understanding the world. And then looking at each place as more than just its geography, but also its degree of connectivity, its population, and its resource endowments, and so forth. So this is going to inform the way I think and approach the world. Now let's talk about the climate effects, because if you were to add this layer or superimpose this layer or animate this layer into what we've just seen, you would get an appreciation for the significant misalignments of geography that characterize our world. And that is really the fundamental point of departure of this book. It's to say that the world is shaped by 4 different layers of geography, right? And they are badly misaligned. The geography of resources on the planet does not well align with the geography of people. The geography of infrastructure and economic activity does not well align with people. The geography of the climate resilient zones of the world, where you can imagine populations fruitfully settling, does not align with the geography of people. And that's what this map is about. You know, when you look at the NASA and IPCC forecasts around that have modeled the impact of temperature rise on the suitability of different geographies for human habitation, this is what they are telling us. This is actually the same map that you can see behind me, by the way. It's so important to me that it's my wall art here at home in my study. And now, again, note that, of course, you see the Great Lakes region right there, smack in the middle of a nice deep green zone. That means it's increasingly suitable for human habitation, even as temperatures rise. Though, of course, we know that in the Western Hemisphere, particularly in the United States and Canada, and certainly in Western Europe and Russia, we're also talking about the countries with the lowest fertility rates, with declining populations were it not for immigration. And in the red zones, the places becoming less habitable, those are societies that are massively populated today. So we have to ask ourselves some fundamental questions today that we may not have raised 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago, which is, does our map make sense? Does our political map make sense in light of these misalignments of geography? And the obvious answer is no. And the question I ask in this book, and it's not a naive question, but a very serious one, is what are we going to do about it? Because it's not something that one country, one government, one organization is going to fix for us. No external actor is going to help us to untangle this situation and to conceive of a new model of realigning our geographies and redistributing the human population. It is very much within our grasp to do so, but the most powerful force in the world happens to be inertia, right? Doing things the way you've done them because that's the way you've done them, not because it's right, not because it's sensible. And I want us to step back and reimagine that human geography in light of these changes, and of course, what that might mean for the Great Lakes region. So right now, our climate diplomacy with COP26 right around the corner is heavily focused on mitigation. It's all about mitigation. Manhattan projects for mitigation, decarbonize industry and supply chains, large-scale renewable energy, geoengineering projects are being talked about more and more, especially deflecting solar radiation. I myself have written about this. We're not giving enough attention, certainly not as much, to adaptation. And this, I believe, is equally important, because as much as I agree that we need Manhattan projects for mitigation, for reducing emissions and so forth, I also am keenly aware and observant, as are all of you, that every single day, even as we try and move towards controlling emissions and reducing emissions, hundreds of millions of people are affected very perniciously by the effects of climate change. And the other thing to remember is that even if we were to stop all greenhouse gas emissions today, the accumulated effects climate change that are baked into our atmosphere are going to continue to have very negative impacts long into the future. A place that has drought today will likely have drought tomorrow. It's already unlivable today, and we're not doing enough to help those people adapt. Now, remember also that the climate is a complex system. It doesn't snap back in a mathematical way towards what it was in 1800 or 1900 or even 2000. The boulder is rolling down the hill, and we don't know exactly where it's going. But remember that the climate is not going to adapt to us. We have to adapt to it. And the one thing of the things that we can do with respect to climate adaptation, which is new kinds of infrastructure, new kinds of building design, climate proofing various geographies. We need Manhattan projects for all of those. But here's the one thing you'll never hear about at COP26. It's large-scale population resettlement. right? Even though the number of climate migrants, climate refugees in the world exceeds every other category of refugee or migrant, right? You won't hear this. Why? Well, who are the people negotiating at COP26? They're representatives of sovereign governments. What word did I just use? Sovereign. What is sovereignty about? In its fundamental, sort of most basic essence, and the vestige of sovereignty that remains for all governments, strong and weak, to still believe that they can impose, is the control of migration, right? It's the control of human beings, the prevention of human beings from crossing borders, because no government can stop air pollution. No government has been able to stop pathogens and viruses or cyber hacks, right? Governments will agree on everything, but they will they will agree on a global accord or convention for everything, but they will never agree that everyone else's people has a right to cross borders and come to their territory, right? So you should never, ever expect, not in our lifetimes or ever, that representatives or negotiators, diplomats of sovereign governments are going to come to a global accord about population redistribution. It will literally never happen. And that's cynical, but that we need to absolutely agree that that is the difficult challenge that we face when we talk about this issue. So it comes down to individual governments. And of course, I put a lot of faith historically over the last several hundred years in the United States and Canada, right? Two countries that have been the biggest winners, history's greatest winners from mass migration. And let's remember that when we talk about mass migration, it's not something new. It's something that we have been doing for 100,000 years. It's something that we've done particularly intensely for the last 200 and 250 years. It's something we've done by and large, to a very, very indisputably large degree, we've done peacefully, and we've done for the mutual benefit of populations. We've done it very well. So I don't have a lot of patience for fear mongering around mass migration, right? Because it's maybe one of the things that we're really, really good at. And it's the one thing that America has been amazing at. And Canada today, of course, has been best of all in terms of the proportion, setting this target of a 1% growth in the population every single year, a target of 400,000 new migrants. Now let's bring in the climate angle and let's hone in on the Great Lakes region. If you look at the climate forecast, and this is a map that's adapted from the climate impact study that many of you would surely have seen. And in that study, they project out to the year 2040, and they look at the expected GDP loss by county, specifically for America, based upon present trajectories for emissions rising and temperatures rising, and then the related effects such as flooding, heat waves, drought, and so forth. And it's not a pretty picture. 4 of America's most significant economic metro areas, New York, Miami, Houston, San Francisco, could throw in Los Angeles, are in a fair bit of trouble, right? Absent very large scale investments in climate adaptation, and quite frankly, even then. And so there isn't really, of course, as we know, when we look at the US, a master plan around how to, again, fix this situation, right? The infrastructure spending is locked. And even if it were ratified, what is it? How much is it? Where is it going? What's it going to do? And so forth isn't a national question in America. Note, of course, the Black regions or the darker shaded regions are ones where you're expected to see GDP growth, right? Rather than GDP loss. And that, of course, not surprisingly applies to the further northern latitudes. Again, another fact that you would be aware of, what the climate models are predicting based upon that last map, is that for every 1 degree Celsius temperature rise, the climate niche for optimal human habitation shifts northward, and about 1 billion people get displaced. And of course, the latitudes on the planet of the most dense human habitation are between 20 and 30 degrees latitude, or you could say between 0 and 30, if you will. But as the niche shifts northward, so too will we. That's not, of course, what we're seeing right now in the US. When you think about the most recent patterns of mobility and relocation, especially during the pandemic, tax policy shapes migration a lot more than climate considerations, right? That's why you've seen Texas and Florida gain in population. Miami's population is larger today than it was before the pandemic, whereas Michigan's population as continues to shrink. Now, that's not what climate models would tell us, and I believe that as human beings, we are mammals endowed with that certain fight or flight instinct. I don't think in the end we want to fight nature. I think we want to adapt to nature, or perhaps adapt by way of fleeing, and that we are going to see a relocation of populations. And of course, public policy is now supporting that. Now, note again that the adaptation of the global climate niche model elevates these regions, these geographies around the Great Lakes region, right? You can see them clearly pop up here behind the words climate niche. And that's, again, sort of, if you will, as close to objective analysis as we have today. But again, how are we doing our fiscal policy? People get to move wherever they want, which is fine. We're free countries. But if you wanted to strategically spend trillions of dollars, and you wanted to do it in a cost-effective way, in a utilitarian way that benefits the maximum number of people, you would probably say, okay, what are the inevitable impacts geographically of climate change? What are the livable and unlivable areas? Where are people going, or where should they likely go in their own best interest? And therefore, how should we allocate our infrastructure spending accordingly? That would be a rational thought process and sequence that you would want to go through with your own precious taxpayer money. That's not what's happening right now, as you well know. And that said, though, you can see that change is afoot, because the Army Corps of Engineers, together with FEMA and the Department of Housing and Urban Development in America, the three of them are basically saying it's time to start doing more accurate ratings and qualifications around flood risk, potentially exerting eminent domain in coastal areas and providing a larger budget for population resettlement. When people have their homes destroyed in coastal areas or elsewhere, they should be given that relocation grant or subsidy, but not be allowed to rebuild where they were before. Instead, perhaps they need to be, sort of encouraged to move to climate resilient areas so that they don't lose all their equity, their home equity in the next disaster, so they don't have to pay such high premiums for insurance, and so that they can contribute to the revitalization of areas that are climate resilient, such as the Great Lakes, but that are depopulated or underpopulated right now. Now, take a case in point, Hurricane Ida, and its sort of battering of the Louisiana Gulf Coast or Gulf coastline. Now, the Louisiana is losing people as a result of the last 15, 20 plus years of natural disasters, going back to Hurricane Katrina. But the state grid, Entergy, continues to spend $1 billion+ a year on repairing power lines, but not sufficiently repairing them to be able to withstand Category 4 kinds of storms. And so they're basically throwing good money after bad. Now, I have full sympathy for people who, are tied to where they live, but, we have a responsibility, right, as a government, a state, federal, local, as taxpayers, as citizens, as brothers and sisters, to think about what's best in light of the situation that we have created. So again, just want to emphasize the thought process that we need to advocate for: climate, migration, infrastructure. View those in a holistic way. And of course, it points you towards a greater allocation of capital towards fortifying and making resilient and making more livable for larger populations the Great Lakes region. Again, right now, we think, America in particular is rather devolved. It's not only devolved in terms of the 50 administrative states, but it's even devolved in terms of natural economic regions. Of course, Canada has its centers of gravity for different industries as well, being an even larger country by size, and being susceptible to even a very broad range of climatic conditions. But here, when you look at the US, you can see that the white patches are the population centers of the US, and some of them, of course, those in the South are quite climate vulnerable. Whereas when we think about infrastructure planning, whether it is the linkages between cities or investments in cities, they should hew towards looking at this overlapping of maps What are the places that are climate resilient? What are the places where infrastructure is needed? Where are the people, and so forth? And again, I'm advocating, and for all of us, hopefully, if you're not already adopting what I think of as a convincing, thought process, let's work on that together and develop that vocabulary. Here is a map from Connectography around what I call the North American Union. It's a term that only a wise Canadian could have coined and did. It's not something that you'll hear emanating from the US, but I want to remind people that the height of the pandemic, the US president, who came into office saying that NAFTA was the worst deal in history, signed the USMCA trade agreement, right? The US-Mexico-Canada trade agreement was signed a year ago in the middle of the pandemic. And it's not an accident, because in times like that and this, which we're in right now, with supply chains being cut off globally or interregionally, countries turn to their neighbors. And in fact, it's very much a result of the Trump tariffs and trade war going back to his first days in office, that the US trades more with Canada and trades more with Mexico, each than it does with China. So we are actually becoming a North American Union, even if you never call it that, right? There doesn't have to be a supranational government for us to use that term. Of course, our future is not destined to follow the supranational path of the European Union. That's not what it's about. It's about complementarities. It's about looking at a map like this, where you see, and of course, the Keystone Pipeline does need to be removed from future editions of this map, because that one didn't pan out. And I think it's something that many people would celebrate. But note, I have electricity grids, and not all of these have been built. A lot of these are proposed. So it's electricity grids, it's gas pipelines, it's railway connections. I even have the aquifers and so forth. One of the issues that I'd raised in Connectography that remains very relevant, of course, is what does a linkage of aquifers look like? What would pricing water and having water sharing agreements between Canada and the United States look like? And can it be done sustainably? It's obviously something of growing interest in the United States. It's not going to be our main focus here today, but I simply wanted to emphasize that the Great Lakes region is not only in and of itself an organic space with its own economy, it is part of this continental scale system. My background is in geopolitics, and when you study 19th century geopolitics, you get exposed to this term continentalism. Continentalism is what drove everything from the westward expansion to the purchase of Alaska to even the Monroe Doctrine. All of these were 19th century major steps, that the United States took in its grand strategy. So continentalism today does not mean that the US invades Canada, right? It does not, don't worry. Continentalism means actually just being educated about the complementarities between our political states, our societies, our economies. I've seen excellent maps of supply chain linkages between American and Canadian cities, and it's so intense and mutually beneficial. Think obviously of the automotive industry across, Michigan and Ontario, take an obvious example, but there's many others in technology, of course, with Waterloo and Silicon Valley, right? In pharmaceuticals, across the board. So we have to do more to blend away the barriers to more intense cooperation across the border, because of course the Great Lakes very much spans both countries and is a treasure for both countries. Now, I've used the word rationality several times. I want to take it a step further. My own company does do some work in this area. I'm just going to very briefly explain it, because we're using big data. We want to look at the 100 data sets. There are about 100 plus data sets that have had, or variables that have had the most significant impact on real estate in the United States in particular. Now, the same work could be applied to Canada, and we're working on that gradually. What we want to do is to use this in a proactive, prospective way to find the signals around where people are starting to go based on climate change factors. Because of course, young people are saying more and more that climate is going to be a major consideration in their decisions around where to invest in real estate. That's obviously not necessarily been the case in the past or the present. So we take that very seriously, and we try to make these longer term calculations. And by making this data available, we also want to nudge people's decisions. Are you going to have to pay more for insurance somewhere? Well, then why would you go there, right? Go to a place that's more climate, resilient. Is the cost of land still very affordable and the cost of housing affordable? How affordable housing is an utmost priority all over the world. That's maybe the one thing, actually, let me just say a quick word here. We don't all perceive climate change equally around the world. The one problem in urban societies everywhere on the planet is affordable housing, right? And if you could have a better forecast of where people are going to be or should be, you would pre-plan. And a term that I use very often in this book is pre-design. Pre-design our habitats so that we sustainably absorb greater populations where they're inevitably going to go. So we're trying to use a neural network tool. There's a complex methodology behind this that allows the entire commercial community really to do more accurate and logical. And this is complex reasoning. It can't really be done, sort of juxtaposing 100 data sets, running regressions, and making future forecasts based on changes in one variable, such as tax or temperature, is too much for the human mind to handle. So you need to take a big data approach. And we hope that it's helpful in some of the master planning, which we all need to go about doing, because that's really what pre-design is about, is master planning. Now, I'm going to start to wind up. I want to, have plenty of time for a conversation, so I won't go too much into this. But I mentioned Canada as being such a generous country in terms of importing migrants and having such a robust talent strategy. It comes at a time when the United States has, unfortunately, and this does go back actually to the Obama administration and the political pressures that he faced through the Trump administration, or you could say it goes back 20 years to the 9/11 terrorist attacks. But be that as it may, the United States is not absorbing the lion's share of young migrants the way it used to, right? Canada is catching up again disproportionately. Even the UK after Brexit, believe it or not, it's easier to migrate to the United Kingdom today than it was before Brexit, and certainly after Brexit, because they wound up with these nursing shortages. In case you're following the news, they have a trucking shortage, they have a trucker shortage. They call them lorry drivers, a shortage of 100,000 truck drivers, because most of them pre-Brexit came from the European Union countries, and then they all left, and they didn't have a strategy to cope. And then came the pandemic, and they have nursing and trucker and shortages across the board. Bottom line is they're not going to be having any turkey for Christmas or anything else warm for that matter, because they seem to be having petrol shortages as well. Countries that make such devastating mistakes in their immigration policy pay the price. So I want to pause again and applaud Canada for not making that mistake. You've just had an election. Germany's just had an election, and guess which parties won? Or in the continuity, obviously, in Canada's case, but you don't have immigration as the hot button, existential, polarizing issue. It was in Germany after the Syrian refugee crisis 5 years ago. Fast forward to today, and guess what? The far right parties are gone, right? They're not influencing national decision making. Germany is officially a mass migration country, and it's the strongest economy in Europe as a result. So, hold on, Canada, keep doing what you're doing, because you'll become a demographic superpower in addition to a resource superpower, in addition to an innovation superpower, and everything else as well. Because one of the arguments I make in the book is that collecting people is collecting power. And the world is not overpopulated. The world is heading into a demographic plateau, right? An actual plateau in the number of human beings on the planet. And it's not going to go back up again. It's going to go down. We are probably not even going to reach 9 billion people. And so instead of thinking of the world as being a Malthusian crisis, we need to realize that the world population is going to begin to decline. And those countries that collect people are the ones that are going to have the industrious population, the innovators, the taxpayers, the entrepreneurs, the caregivers, and the students, and so forth. All of that matters a lot in a depopulating world. And it's not a phrase you may even be familiar with. The term I use in the book is peak humanity. It's not a phrase we've needed, because during the course of the 20th century, the world population quadrupled, and now boom, it's about to plateau. It basically has plateaued, if not for immigration, right, across the OECD world. So it matters who is getting the workers at different skill levels based upon their economic needs. Now, of course, the Great Lakes region has that need because it has to diversify its economy. It has to reinvent itself. away from traditional sectors towards new innovative sectors, services, economic areas, construction, 3D printing, all of the things that are going on in the new economy, and capturing remote workers as well, which is something that places like Vermont are doing as they offer subsidies or gifts, for remote workers who will move there. But bring in young people. Now, again, you can tell that this has been happening in Toronto, and it's happening in other cities across Canada. So if you look at this ranking by BCG of the sort of reputation or desirability of countries based upon these kind of global worker surveys, Canada ranks very, very high, is doing very well, has really climbed up, and so forth. And you want to obviously rank high on this list and attract people. So what can you do in the Great Lakes region to say, hey, we're climate resilient, we have adequate housing, or do you, right? It's a big priority. We need to invest into that. Full broadband access for everyone, good mobility and public transportation, all of those things. So there's many, rankings of the variables that make for friendliness to attracting youth. You want to be doing them in the Great Lakes region in the same way that, before the pandemic, there were like 2 countries that had nomad visa schemes, right? Today, there's about 75 countries that have nomad visas that are saying, come one, come all, just come and live here, stay in Airbnb, eat in our restaurants, just spend money in our economy because we miss people when they're gone, which is really what happened during the pandemic. So, think about branding the Great Lakes region. What I do in the book is actually go and survey all of the places that I view as potential climate oases, right? In the Great Lakes region, right there, you see is quite a density. Alberta as well, the Rocky Mountain region, the US, much of Europe, quite frankly. Notice the latitude of Europe is more like Canada than the United States. So it is more climate propitious. Of course, they're doing so much more with renewable energy. Western Russia, the Caucasus Mountains, Kazakhstan, you name it. In the book, as you'll see, I have chapters on every single one of these places. And it's not just about climate. I, of course, look at their politics and their economics and their investments to see if they are going to have the potential to absorb larger populations. But there's no question, almost to end where I began, and this is where page 1 of the book really is to say, the Great Lakes region is the place that I stumbled upon in my investigation 10 plus years ago as the place that ticks all the boxes. Again, not just the economic potential, not just the climate resilience, but obviously the political stability and many other factors. And I would most certainly bet on it even more now than I would 10 years ago. So I'm going to pause there. I have a whole bunch of slides around some of the specific, technologies that I think are so critical. But as Mark and I discussed, he'll email the deck to everyone who's on this call, so you can go and have a look through what I think of are some of the cutting edge technologies. I'll also just say that none of this is foreordained. In the book, I posit 4 scenarios. It's really the scaffolding for the book. And 3 of the scenarios for the global future are quite negative. I'll be honest with you. And it's not because I'm not an optimistic person. I try to be. But I said, here are 4 possible futures. And they're all going to come true, actually. The question is where. So what do you want to be? Do you want to be a fortress that invests in only your own sustainability, but lacks the manpower to really be dynamic? Do you want to live in a hunter-gatherer, survivalist kind of world that looks like the new Middle Ages? Are you worried about a world of resource wars and conflicts over precious resources that would no doubt drag every region down with it? Or is there a Northern Lights scenario that I posit in the book as well, in which people can recirculate more, and that when we inhabit climate resilient zones, we don't trample on them and destroy them the way we've already done for generations, but instead do so sustainably. And the previous slides that you'll see later on are really about what the infrastructure, what the technologies are that enable that today already. And we can certainly talk more about it now. And the final thing I want to say is that with this book, I'm supporting a very noble cause. And that is National Geographic explorer Paul Salopek, who's walking across the entire world. He started in Ethiopia 8 years ago and has made it to China. And over the course of the next decade, he will not stop until he reaches Tierra del Fuego in Argentina. National Geographic and other organizations have been supporting this walk from the beginning. This is a man who's giving his life to the exploration of our nomadic origins and to documenting, what is our deepest essence, which is that, in fact, that to move is human. And it's a phrase that we share. So from the pre-sales of this book, including those of you who have generously bought the book and joined this call, I'm donating a portion of those proceeds to support his walk in the years ahead. And so I urge you to directly go and learn more about the Out of Eden walk, and to lend greater support and publicity to his incredible, not just adventure, but his educational enterprise that really benefits all of us and how we think of ourselves. And hopefully, when he makes it, across the Bering Strait to Alaska and into Canada, maybe he'll make a detour to the Great Lakes region and visit with all of you. I've personally gone and walked with him, as you see here, in very remote parts of the world, and I'm going to continue to over the next decade whenever I get the chance. So it's such an important mission, and it really embodies the essence of what I'm trying to convey in this book, that we can be more nomadic and more mobile again as a species, and we can do so sustainably. And I know that you all share that mission with me, and I look forward to getting your thoughts on how we can achieve that goal together. So thank you again so much, everyone.